The Duke of Northmere, a man whose gaze could silence a room, stood before the one woman he could never forget. "You are to be another man's duchess," he stated, his voice a low rumble of possession and pain. Eliza Grayson, poised and elegant, met his stare, her heart a battlefield of past and present. "You lost the right to speak on my future 5 years ago," she replied, her words as sharp as glass. He had shattered her world once, leaving her in disgrace at the altar. Now he was back, powerful and determined. But was it too late? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The drawing room of the Grayson townhouse was a study in refined tranquility, a place where sunlight, strained through pristine lace curtains, fell in polite, orderly stripes across the polished mahogany. It smelled of beeswax and the faint, sweet perfume of roses, their petals arranged just so in a porcelain vase on the mantelpiece. The only sounds were the delicate clink of a silver spoon against a teacup and the measured, placid tones of Lord Alastair Harrington as he spoke of parliamentary debates. Miss Eliza Grayson, his intended, sat opposite him, a portrait of serene attentiveness. Alastair was a handsome man, in a thoroughly conventional and unthreatening way. His features were even, his hair was impeccably styled, and his conversation, much like his life, revolved around predictable and stable topics like estate management and the shifting loyalties within the House of Lords. He was, by every measure of London society, a perfect match. He was respectable, kind, and utterly safe. Eliza appreciated this. She truly did. She appreciated the calm he represented, the quiet harbour he offered after the devastating storm that had been her life 5 years prior. As she listened to him drone on about a new agricultural bill, she took a sip of her tea, the warmth of the porcelain, a small, grounding comfort in her hands. This was her future, a life of quiet respectability, of passionless comfort and muted colours. She had long ago packed away the girlish dreams of a grand, sweeping love, locking them in a chest in the attic of her heart. Hope was a dangerous indulgence, and she had learned its price in the most public and humiliating way imaginable. She was settling, and she had made her peace with it, or so she told herself, every single day. The resignation was a cloak she wore, heavy but familiar, protecting her from the chill of what might have been. The clink of Alastair's cup as he set it down was just loud enough to snag a thread in the tapestry of her composure, and for a horrifying, vertiginous moment, the drawing room dissolved. The scent of roses became the overwhelming, cloying perfume of lilies, thousands of them, their white throats open as if in silent scream. The polite sunlight was replaced by the solemn, expectant hush of a packed church. She was no longer in her comfortable afternoon dress, but in an ivory silk wedding gown, its weight suffocating, a beautiful shroud for a future that was about to die. She could feel the tremor in her hands again, the way they had clutched her bouquet, the stems slick with nervous perspiration. She remembered the silence, how it had started as reverent and slowly, horribly, curdled into a dreadful, questioning stillness that echoed in the vaulted ceilings. Time stretched and warped, each tick of the great church clock a hammer blow against her heart. Then, the memory sharpened to a single, excruciating point of focus. A footman, his face a mask of uncomfortable pity, walking stiffly up the aisle. He didn't approach her, but her mother, handing over a small, crisp, folded note. She saw it all again, her mother's gloved fingers fumbling with the seal, her face, already pale with anticipation, draining of all color until it was the shade of bleached bone. The note contained only 5 words, 5 words that had detonated her world, leaving nothing but rubble. "I cannot. Forgive me." The memory was not a thought, it was a physical blow, a visceral gut punch that still, after 5 years, could steal the air from her lungs. It was the memory of the whispers starting, of her father's face turning to stone, of the long, lonely walk back down the aisle, a bride with no groom, a woman undone. "Eliza? My dear, are you quite well?" Alastair's voice, laced with mild concern, pulled her back to the present. She blinked, the sunlit drawing room reassembling itself around her. "Forgive me, Alastair," she said, forcing a small, placid smile. "I was merely lost in thought." The placid surface of London society was, however, about to be shattered. A few days later, in a different drawing room, one far more crowded and noisy, Lady Beatrice, A woman whose tongue was as sharp as her eyes were observant was holding court. Her words, delivered with theatrical relish, cut through the chatter like a guillotine. "Can you believe it?" she exclaimed, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "The old Duke of Northmere has finally kicked the bucket, poor soul. And with no direct heir, the title and the entire Northmere fortune has passed to some distant, disgraced cousin." She paused for effect, her audience hanging on her every syllable. "A Harrow, of all people, and not just any Harrow." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss that was somehow more audible than her previous shout. "Lord Nathaniel Harrow, the very same one who vanished into thin air and left poor Eliza Grayson standing at the altar." The news spread through the ton like wildfire, a delicious scandal to be savored and dissected. The man who had disappeared in shame, the architect of Eliza Grayson's social ruin, was returning. And he was not returning as a penitent outcast, but as His Grace, the Duke of Northmere, one of the most powerful, wealthy, and suddenly eligible peers in the entire kingdom. Eliza, of course, heard the news. It was impossible not to. It was on everyone's lips, a constant, buzzing reminder of the past she had worked so hard to bury. She met the whispers and the pitying glances with a cool, unbothered facade, a mask of serene contentment she had perfected over the years. Her engagement to Lord Harrington was her shield and her armor. She would show them all. She had moved on. She was happy. The annual Bridgerton Ball, the absolute pinnacle of the social season, was the perfect stage for this performance. The ballroom of Bridgerton House was a breathtaking kaleidoscope of shimmering silks, glittering jewels, and soaring, joyful music from the string quartet. The air hummed with energy, laughter, and the rustle of 1,000 gowns. On Alistair's arm, Eliza was the very picture of poised elegance, her smile fixed, her head held high. She danced, she made polite conversation, she projected an image of a woman entirely content with her lot. She would not let the ghost of Nathaniel Harrow haunt her. But ghosts, she was about to learn, have a way of materializing when you least expect them. It happened just as the quartet reached the crescendo of a waltz. The music seemed to falter, the dancers to slow, as the master of ceremonies, his voice booming over the crowd, made an announcement that sent a shockwave through the room. Announcing His Grace, the Duke of Northmere. A hush fell, the kaleidoscope of color and movement stilled, and then he entered. It was him, but it was not. The boyish, charming lord she had loved was gone. The man who stood in the grand archway was taller, broader, his shoulders filling the frame of his exquisitely tailored black coat. His face, once so quick to smile, was harder, carved from some sterner material by experiences she could not begin to imagine. His jaw was set, and his eyes, those same deep blue eyes that had once looked at her with such adoration, now held a new, commanding depth, a shadow of pain and a glint of unyielding resolve. He was no longer Nathaniel Harrow, the boy who had broken her heart. He was the Duke of Northmere, a man who commanded attention without demanding it. The room erupted in a low, sibilant whisper, a collective intake of breath. And then, as if drawn by an invisible string, his gaze swept the room and found hers. Across the crowded floor, through the sea of faces and the glittering candlelight, their eyes locked. The music, the whispers, the entire world seemed to melt away, leaving only the two of them suspended in a silent, suffocating bubble of shared history, unresolved pain, and 5 years of unspoken words. Her heart, which had been beating in a steady, respectable rhythm, suddenly hammered against her ribs, a wild, frantic bird trapped in a cage. Alistair, blissfully oblivious to the cataclysm that had just occurred in his fiancée's soul, leaned in, his voice a pleasant murmur against her ear. "My dear, are you quite all right? You look as if you've seen a ghost." Eliza's throat was tight, her own voice a strained, barely audible whisper as she stared at the man who had been her everything, and then her nothing. "Perhaps I have." The world rushed back in a dizzying, overwhelming flood of sensation, but all she could feel was the maelstrom inside her. The pure, unadulterated shock was the first wave, so powerful it left her numb. It was followed by a surge of white-hot anger, a fury she had suppressed for 5 long years, now boiling to the surface. It was an anger at his cowardice, at his cruelty, at the public humiliation he had subjected her to. But beneath the shock, and beneath the anger, there was something else, something far more terrifying. It was a treacherous, undeniable flicker of the love she thought she had so carefully and completely buried. It was a flicker of the girl she had been, the girl who had loved him with an all-consuming fire, a fire she now realized had never truly been extinguished, only banked, waiting for a single glance to stir its embers back to life. A few days after the Bridgerton ball, the world had not ended. The sun continued to rise, tea was still served at 4, and London society, having feasted on the delicious drama of the Duke of Northmere's return, had moved on to the next morsel of gossip. Eliza clung to this routine, this predictable rhythm, as a drowning woman clings to a piece of driftwood. She needed to believe that the cataclysmic moment their eyes had met across the ballroom had been a mere tremor, not the earthquake it had felt like. She needed to believe that the man who had returned was a stranger, a ghost wearing a familiar face, and that the wild, treacherous beating of her own heart had been nothing more than a phantom limb, aching for a love long since amputated. She sought refuge in the simple pleasure of a morning walk in Hyde Park, her spirited younger sister, Clara, providing a cheerful, chattering buffer against the silence of her own thoughts. Clara, with her bright eyes and romantic notions, saw the world as a grand stage for epic love stories, and she had been practically vibrating with excitement since the ball. "Did you see him, Eliza?" Clara asked for the 10th time, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "He is not a boy any longer. He is like a hero from one of my novels, all brooding and mysterious, and the way he looked at you." It was as if the entire room had vanished. "Clara, please," Eliza said, her voice tighter than she intended. "It is not a novel. It was a brief, awkward moment. I am to be married to Lord Harrington. That is my reality. Alistair is very nice," Clara conceded, kicking at a loose pebble on the path. "But is nice truly enough, after what you had? After a love that people still whisper about 5 years later?" Before Eliza could formulate a response that would both silence her sister and reassure herself, the peaceful atmosphere of the park was abruptly altered. A magnificent black stallion, its coat gleaming like polished jet, came into view, its powerful strides commanding the attention of everyone on the path, and upon it sat the very man who was the subject of their conversation, Nathaniel. He was not in the formal attire of the ballroom, but in riding clothes that fit his broad shoulders and lean frame with a casual elegance that was somehow more intimidating. He seemed to be a part of the powerful animal he rode, a single entity of strength and grace. He saw them. Of course, he saw them. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes before his expression settled into a carefully constructed mask of formal courtesy. He reined in the stallion, dismounting with a fluid movement that spoke of years spent in the saddle. He handed the reins to a waiting groom who seemed to have appeared from nowhere and approached them, his boots making a soft, deliberate sound on the gravel path. The air grew thick, charged with unspoken history. "Miss Grayson, Miss Clara," he said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that vibrated through Eliza's very bones. He gave a slight, formal bow. "I realize my presence is an unwelcome intrusion." He directed his gaze solely at Eliza, and she felt pinned by its intensity. "I only wish to express, in person, my deepest, most sincere apologies for the unforgivable pain I caused you." The apology, delivered with such grave sincerity, was a direct assault on the fortress of anger she had so carefully constructed. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, had rehearsed 1,000 scathing replies, but faced with the reality of him, the man of flesh and blood, her throat felt tight. She lifted her chin, her voice emerging as cold and sharp as ice. "Your Grace," she said, bestowing the title upon him like a brand. "Your apologies are 5 years too late. They are of no use to me now." She drew a steadying breath, deploying her only defense. "I am to be married," she emphasized the words, making them a shield, a wall between the shattered past and the stable future she had chosen. She saw a flicker of pain in his eyes, a brief crack in his ducal facade, before it was smoothed over once more. "I see," he said softly. "Then I can only wish you the happiness you so richly deserve." He bowed again, a gesture of finality, and without another word, he turned, mounted his stallion, and rode away, leaving Eliza standing on the path, her heart hammering a frantic, chaotic rhythm against her ribs, a traitorous drumbeat in the quiet morning air. The encounter in the park was only the first move in what Eliza quickly came to understand was a calculated campaign. 2 days later, a footman announced a delivery. In the grand entrance hall of the Grayson townhouse stood an ostentatious, almost funereal bouquet of white lilies. There must have been 100 of them, their waxy petals unfurled, their golden stamens heavy with pollen. The scent, once her favorite in the world, now filled the hall with the cloying, suffocating perfume of a memory she could not escape. It was the scent of her wedding day, the scent of her humiliation. Attached to the extravagant display by a white satin ribbon was a small, thick card of expensive parchment. There was no message, no flowery sentiment. There was only a single bold black initial, N. A wave of pure, unadulterated fury washed over Eliza, so potent it made her tremble. It was an act of breathtaking arrogance, a deliberate invasion of her home and her hard-won peace. He was not just apologizing, he was reminding her, forcing her to remember the depth of what they had lost, what he had thrown away. "Get them out," she commanded, her voice shaking with rage. "I want them thrown in the street. Burn them. I do not care. I will not have them in this house." The footman, startled by her vehemence, quickly complied, carrying the fragrant ghost of the past out of her sight. But the scent lingered, a phantom presence in the air for the rest of the day. Later that evening, seeking refuge in the library, Eliza found Clara sitting by the fire, a book open in her lap. Tucked carefully between the pages, being pressed into a memory, was a single perfect white lily bloom. Clara met her sister's gaze, her expression a mixture of apology and defiance, a silent acknowledgement of the epic, tragic romance she refused to let die. Eliza said nothing, turning away with a sigh that was heavy with the weight of a love that simply refused to be buried. Nathaniel's siege continued, moving from the private sphere to the public. A week later, Eliza and Alistair were seated in their prominent box at the Royal Opera House. The performance was a brilliant Italian tragedy, but Eliza found she could not focus on the drama unfolding on the stage. Her attention, and indeed the attention of half the audience, was drawn to the even more prominent Duke's box, situated directly across the grand, gilded theatre. There, cloaked in shadow, sat Nathaniel. He was not watching the soprano's heart-wrenching aria. He was not looking at the stage at all. His intense, melancholic gaze was fixed entirely, unblinkingly, on her. It was not a flirtatious glance or a casual look. It was a stare of such profound concentration that it felt like a physical touch, a tangible pressure against her skin. He was drinking in the sight of her, his expression a complex tapestry of longing, regret, and a fierce, unwavering focus that made her feel both hunted and worshipped. The attention was so palpable, so unnervingly intimate in such a public space, that the air in her own box grew thick and heavy. Alistair, who had been trying to explain the finer points of the libretto, finally fell silent. He followed her gaze, and his pleasant, placid demeanor hardened into something sharp and cold. A muscle feathered in his jaw. He did not comment on the Duke's stare, but his actions spoke volumes. He placed a hand on Eliza's arm, his fingers gripping her just a little too tightly, and gently but firmly pulled her slightly back into the shadows of their box, partially shielding her from Nathaniel's view. It was a gesture of possession, a clear, silent warning. "The Duke of Northmere seems to have a fixation," Alistair said finally, his voice tight with displeasure, though he kept it low enough for only her to hear. "I do not like the way he looks at you. It is improper." He paused, his grip tightening for a fraction of a second before relaxing. "You are to be my wife." The words were meant to be reassuring, a statement of fact, but in the charged atmosphere of the opera house, with Nathaniel's gaze still burning across the theatre, they sounded like a warning. They sounded like the clang of a closing gate. The final assault on her defenses came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. A sudden, violent downpour had caught Eliza while she was shopping on Bond Street, turning the bustling thoroughfare into a mess of slick cobblestones and fleeing pedestrians. Her carriage, which was to have met her, was nowhere in sight, delayed by the snarled traffic. Huddled under the inadequate shelter of a shop awning, watching her silk slippers become steadily more ruined, she felt a familiar sense of frustration and helplessness. Just as she was resigning herself to being soaked to the bone, a grand, gleaming carriage, its lacquer shining even in the grey, wet gloom, pulled to a stop directly in front of her. The door was opened, not by a footman, but by the owner himself. Nathaniel leaned out, his expression one of polite concern, the opulent interior of the carriage visible behind him. The Northmere crest, bold and unmistakable, was emblazoned on the door. "Allow me to see you home, Miss Grayson," he said, his voice carrying easily over the drumming of the rain. "It is the very least I can do to prevent you from catching a chill." She wanted to refuse. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to refuse. To accept his help felt like a surrender, a concession she was not willing to make. But the rain was relentless, cascading from the awning in a steady sheet, and the street was empty of any other prospects. Her other option was to stand there, becoming increasingly drenched and humiliated until her own carriage finally arrived. It was a choice between pride and practicality, and with a sigh of stiff reluctance, she accepted. The carriage ride was 5 minutes of the most exquisite and unbearable tension Eliza had ever experienced. The interior was even more opulent up close, upholstered in dark green velvet and smelling of rich leather, old books, and his distinct, masculine scent of sandalwood and rain. The rhythmic clatter of the horses' hooves on the wet cobblestones and the drumming of the downpour on the roof were the only sounds for a long moment. She sat perfectly straight, her hands clasped in her lap, her gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window, acutely aware of him sitting opposite her, his presence filling the small enclosed space. "I heard you are to marry Lord Harrington," he said finally, his voice quiet and even. "He is a good man. You deserve to be happy." The words, so simple and yet so loaded, sent a fresh wave of anger and confusion through her. How dare he speak of her happiness? "My happiness is no longer your concern, Your Grace," she replied, her voice clipped and formal, a stark contrast to the wild, chaotic beating of her heart. It was a lie. Her heart was betraying her at every turn, thumping a frantic rhythm against her ribs at his mere proximity. She could feel his gaze on her, a warm, searching look, and it was a monumental struggle to maintain her composure, to keep the mask of icy indifference from cracking. She felt like a pane of glass, holding itself together under immense pressure, knowing that one more word, one more look, might be enough to shatter her completely. Nathaniel's London residence was less a home than a fortress of solitude. In his study, a dark, masculine room panelled in ancient oak and crowded with maps and books, the trappings of his new ducal life felt like a costume. Here, amidst the scent of old paper and leather, he was not the Duke of Northmere, but the man he had been forced to become over 5 hard years. He stood before a massive fireplace, the flames casting flickering shadows on his stern features as he unsealed a letter delivered moments before by a courier whose face was as discreet and forgettable as the plain wax seal he had broken. The paper was cheap, the script hurried, but the message it contained chilled the air more than the autumn evening outside. It was a coded warning from a former associate, a man who had watched his back in the dangerous, sun-bleached ports of the Mediterranean. The note was short, its brevity a testament to its urgency. "The eagle has not forgotten the debt. He hears whispers of your new perch. Be wary." Nathaniel crushed the paper in his fist. The eagle, Baron von Hesse, a man whose cruelty was matched only by his ambition, a predator who never forgave a slight and never forgot a debt. Nathaniel had known this was a risk. Returning to England, claiming the dukedom, was like painting a target on his own back. He had spent 5 years dismantling the web of his father's ruinous obligations, building a fortune with the singular purpose of destroying the baron's leverage over him. He had thought himself successful, had believed the unexpected inheritance of the Northmere title was the final checkmate, a wall of power and influence the baron could not breach. This note was a stark reminder that the game was not over. The eagle was not a creature to be easily deterred, he was merely one to wait for the most opportune moment to strike. Nathaniel's return to London had not been just a quest to reclaim a lost love. It was the final move in a dangerous war, and he had just announced his position to the enemy. He tossed the crumpled note into the fire, watching as the flames consumed the warning, the orange light glinting in his eyes like the spark of renewed battle. Eliza found her own form of sanctuary, in a quiet, dusty bookshop off a lesser-known square in Bloomsbury. It was a place of gentle silence, where the only sounds were the soft rustle of turning pages and the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. The air smelled of aging paper and binding glue, a scent she found infinitely more comforting than the cloying perfumes of London's drawing rooms. Here, surrounded by the quiet company of 1,000 stories, she could almost forget her own. She was tracing the faded gold leaf on the spine of a book of poetry when a shadow fell over the page. "I had a feeling I might find you here." Nathaniel's voice, low and stripped of its formal ducal tone, made her start. He had cornered her in a secluded alcove, the towering shelves of philosophy and verse forming a private room within the public space. He was no longer the composed duke from the park or the haunting spectre from the opera. The mask of cool control had slipped, and in his eyes she saw a raw, unnerving desperation. "Your Grace," she began, her voice stiff, "this is hardly appropriate." "Damn appropriate," he cut in, his voice a low, urgent whisper that was more intimate than a shout. He took a step closer, and she instinctively stepped back, her hand flying to the bookshelf for support. "Eliza, please, 5 minutes. That is all I ask. I cannot explain myself in a crowded ballroom or on a public street." "We have nothing to discuss," she insisted, her heart beginning a frantic, panicked rhythm. "The time for explanations passed 5 years ago." "No," he said, and the word was filled with such pain that it momentarily silenced her. "The time for explanations has only just arrived." He reached out, his fingers closing around her arm. The touch was not rough, but it was firm, a desperate pleading anchor. "You must know this, Eliza. Whatever else you believe, you must know that I never stopped loving you. Not for a moment. Every single day I was gone. Every wretched, lonely hour, I was thinking of you." His voice cracked on the last word. "I left to protect you." The claim was so audacious, so utterly contrary to the reality of her experience, that a bitter, incredulous laugh escaped her lips. "Protect me?" she scoffed, the sound sharp and brittle in the quiet alcove. "Protect me from what? Your own cowardice? You speak of protection, but you left me in ruins, Nathaniel." The use of his first name was a slip, a crack in her own icy facade, and it seemed to hang in the air between them, a testament to a familiarity she was trying so desperately to deny. "You left me in social and emotional ruins, a public spectacle, a cautionary tale whispered at tea parties. That was your protection." The word ruins seemed to strike him like a physical blow. The desperation in his eyes was momentarily eclipsed by a wave of profound soul, deep agony, a memory so vivid she could almost see it playing out behind his gaze. The bookshop, with its scent of old paper and dust, dissolved around them, replaced by the suffocating tension of another room in another time. It was the week before the wedding. A younger Nathaniel, his face etched with a dawning horror, stood before his father in the dim, cluttered study of their far less grand family home. Lord Harrow, a man who had once been robust and cheerful, was a ghost of himself, his shoulders slumped in defeat, his hands trembling as he held an empty glass of brandy. "What is this, father?" Nathaniel had demanded, holding up a letter bearing a sinister, unfamiliar crest. "Another request for funds? We have nothing left to give." "It is not a request, my boy," his father had whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "It is a summons." He finally looked up, and the sheer terror in his eyes made Nathaniel's blood run cold. "I owe him, Nat. I owe him everything." He confessed it all then, the words tumbling out in a torrent of shame and fear. The gambling debts, which had started as a gentleman's vice, had spiraled into a ruinous addiction. The man he owed was not some London moneylender who could be stalled with promises. He was Baron von Hesse, a man whose name was spoken in hushed, fearful tones in the darker corners of the continent, a man known for his unspeakable cruelty, a man who collected debts, not just in coin, but in blood and servitude. "He does not just want the money, Nathaniel," his father choked out, burying his face in his hands. "The debt is too large. No, he wants something more. He wants our name, our connections." The Baron's horrifying proposition was laid bare. He knew of Eliza's father, Lord Grayson, and his extensive shipping interests. Von Hesse was involved in a treasonous smuggling operation, moving weapons and seditious materials across the Channel, and he saw the upcoming marriage as the perfect opportunity to gain access to the Grayson fleet. He wanted Nathaniel to use his position as Eliza's husband to coerce her father into his scheme. "And if I refuse?" Nathaniel had asked, his voice dangerously quiet. His father's sob was his only answer for a moment. He was very clear. he finally managed to say, his body racked with tremors. He said he would not just see us financially ruined and thrown into a debtor's prison. He said he would visit his displeasure upon Eliza. He described in detail what he would do to her family, to ensure our compliance. He sees her as leverage, Nat, a tool to ensure we do his bidding. In that moment, Nathaniel saw the trap closing around him. It was a perfect, diabolical snare. If he married Eliza, he would be placing her directly in the path of a monster, making her a pawn in a treasonous plot that would destroy her family. If he defied the Baron, he would be sentencing her to a fate worse than death. The Baron had ensured that every path led to her destruction. Every path, except one. The only way to save her, the only way to invalidate the Baron's leverage and remove her from the equation entirely, was to remove himself. He had to break her heart to save her life. He had to become a villain in her story to prevent a far more dangerous one from ever touching her. The memory ended with the image of himself, hours later, sitting alone at his desk, a single sheet of paper before him. The quill felt impossibly heavy in his hand. He thought of her bright smile, of the future they had planned, of the love that was the only true and good thing in his life, and with tears blurring the ink, making it bleed into the fibers of the paper, he wrote the 5 words that would shatter her world and his own. I cannot. Forgive me. Back in the present, in the quiet of the bookshop, the echo of that devastating choice was still raw in Nathaniel's face. Eliza stared at him, her own anger faltering in the face of his visible torment. His story, fragmented and incomplete as it was, felt terrifyingly plausible. It resonated with a truth that went deeper than her own wounded pride. The man she had loved, the boy she had laughed with, had he been capable of such a monumental, soul-crushing sacrifice? The idea was both horrifying and, in a way that frightened her to her very core, deeply, tragically romantic. It recast the villain of her past into a tragic hero, and she did not know what to do with the information. She pushed the thought away, a desperate attempt to shore up the crumbling walls of her resentment. It was easier to be angry. Anger was a clean, sharp emotion. This dawning, reluctant empathy was a murky, treacherous swamp that threatened to pull her under. Without another word, she pulled her arm from his grasp, her face a mask of profound confusion. She turned and fled the alcove, her footsteps echoing in the silent shop as she ran from him, from the past, and from the terrible, beautiful, heartbreaking possibility that everything she had believed for 5 years had been a lie. Lord Alistair Harrington, a man who had built his life upon the foundations of propriety and control, felt those foundations cracking. The ground beneath his feet, once so solid, had begun to shift the moment the Duke of Northmere had returned to London. He saw the change in Eliza, the flicker of an old flame in her eyes that she tried so desperately to hide. He felt her pulling away, not in any overt act of defiance, but in the subtle, almost imperceptible increase in the distance between them. His fiancée was slipping through his fingers like fine sand, and he would not allow it. His club, a bastion of masculine power smelling of cigar smoke, old leather, and brandy, was the perfect place to begin his counter-offensive. Seated in a plush wing-back chair, surrounded by influential members of the peerage whose whispers could build or destroy a reputation overnight, Alistair took action. He did not make direct accusations. That would be uncouth, vulgar. Instead, he planted seeds, tiny, poisonous seeds of doubt that he knew would flourish in the fertile ground of gossip and speculation. A remarkable turn of fortune, is it not? He mused, swirling the amber liquid in his glass as he spoke to Lord Weatherby, a man whose ear was permanently attached to the grapevine of the Tun, the Northmere title, and the fortune that comes with it. One does wonder how a man from a family so thoroughly ruined comes into such a position so quickly. He took a slow sip, letting the question hang in the air. My sources on the continent, you understand, they speak of morally ambiguous ventures, fortunes made and lost in the blink of an eye, not always through the most savory of means. He let the words drift, confident in their power. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a more confidential tone. Of course I wish the man no ill will, but character, gentlemen. A man's character is everything, is it not? And a past shrouded in mystery and rumor, well, it does make one question the stability of the present. The rumors began to circulate almost immediately. spreading from the club to the drawing rooms and ballrooms of London. Northmere was a mercenary, an opportunist, a man whose shiny new title was merely a thin layer of gold paper over a dishonorable, perhaps even dangerous, past. Alistair was not just fighting for Eliza, he was fighting for his own reputation, for the perfect, orderly life he had planned, and he would use any weapon at his disposal. The Duchess of Pemberton's annual masquerade ball was the most anticipated event of the season, a night where the rigid structures of society were momentarily loosened by the anonymity of a mask. The grand ballroom was electric, with a heightened sense of drama and intrigue, 1,000 masked figures swirling under the light of a dozen crystal chandeliers. The air was thick with perfume, secrets, and the incessant gossip that Alistair had so carefully cultivated. Eliza wore a simple, elegant gown of silver silk and a matching mask that covered only her eyes. But she had never felt more exposed. The whispers seemed to follow her, the unseen eyes of the ton scrutinizing her every move. Alistair stayed unnervingly close, his hand a constant proprietary weight on the small of her back, guiding her through the throng as if she were a prized possession he feared might be stolen. His presence, once a comfort, now felt like a cage. He was a sentinel, his gaze sweeping the room not with enjoyment, but with a vigilant, searching intensity. He was looking for the Duke, and then, during a lull in the music, as couples fanned themselves and drank champagne, Alistair made his move. He took a glass from a passing footman, raised it high, and tapped it with his ring, the clear, sharp sound cutting through the chatter. The room quieted, all masked faces turning toward them. Elisa's blood ran cold. "A toast," Alistair announced, his voice carrying across the vast room with practiced ease. He smiled, but it was a smile that did not reach his eyes. He placed his free hand over hers, a gesture of ownership for all to see. "To my fiancée, Miss Eliza Grayson." A polite murmur went through the crowd, but Alistair was not finished. His gaze swept the room, deliberately seeking out a tall figure in a black domino mask who stood near the French doors. A woman whose virtue and loyalty are as unshakable as her beauty. In a world where honor can be bought and sold, where titles can be acquired through means one shudders to imagine, true constancy is a rare jewel indeed. The meaning was unmistakable. It was a public declaration of ownership and a direct, brutal challenge to Nathaniel. A gauntlet thrown down in the center of the most public stage in London. Eliza felt a wave of heat rise to her cheeks, a blush of pure humiliation. Alistair was not toasting her, he was using her, turning her into a symbol of his victory. Across the room, the man in the black domino mask remained perfectly still, his expression unreadable, his silence more menacing than any angry retort. The toast was met with a wave of enthusiastic applause, but to Eliza, it sounded like the clang of prison doors. Overwhelmed by the heat, the whispers, and the suffocating weight of Alistair's public claim, Eliza felt a desperate need to escape. Murmuring an excuse about the heat, she pulled away from Alistair's grasp and fled through the nearest set of French doors, stepping out onto a cool, moonlit terrace that overlooked the Duchess's famous gardens. The sudden quiet was a balm, the night air a blessed relief against her hot skin. She walked to the stone balustrade, her hands gripping the cool, damp stone as she took a deep, shuddering breath. She was followed, but not by Alistair. A moment later, a quiet footstep sounded behind her. She turned, her heart leaping into her throat, to see the tall, dark figure from the ballroom, Nathaniel. He had removed his mask, and in the pale moonlight, his face was a study in controlled emotion, his eyes dark, pools of regret and concern. He did not crowd her. He did not touch her. He simply stood a few feet away, giving her space, his hands clasped behind his back. The contrast with Alistair's constant, suffocating presence was so stark it was like a physical blow. "He is afraid of losing you," Nathaniel said, his voice quiet, a mere murmur in the vast, silent garden. Eliza turned back to the darkness, unable to meet his gaze. "He has no reason to be," she replied, the words sounding hollow even to her own ears. "Doesn't he?" Nathaniel took a single slow step closer. "Eliza, look at how he treats you, like a possession to be guarded, a beautiful bird whose wings he feels the need to clip. That toast, that was not about honoring you. It was about branding you as his. A man of honor, a man who was truly confident in a woman's love, would not need to build a cage for her. His words struck a chord deep within her, articulating a truth she had been unwilling to admit to herself. Just then, another figure appeared in the brightly lit doorway of the ballroom. Alistair, his face was a thundercloud of fury as he strode onto the terrace, his pleasant demeanor completely gone, replaced by the cold, hard anger of a man whose authority had been challenged. "Your Grace," Alistair said, his voice dangerously soft, dripping with contempt. "I believe you are bothering my fiancée." Nathaniel did not even glance at him. His eyes remained fixed on Eliza, a silent question in their depths. Then, slowly, he turned to face his rival. "I believe," Nathaniel replied, his own voice just as soft, but laced with a steel that Alistair's lacked. "That is for Miss Grayson to decide." It was in that single tense moment, a silent standoff between the two men under the cold, impartial light of the moon, that everything became terrifyingly clear to Eliza. The two men before her represented two different kinds of love, two different futures. Alistair's love was about ownership, about security, about maintaining a perfect, respectable facade for the world. It was a love that sought to control, to possess, to lock away. It was safe, but it was a gilded cage. Nathaniel's love, however flawed his past actions, however much pain it had caused, was about her. It was a desperate, all-consuming, world-altering love. It was a love that had driven him into exile to protect her and had brought him back to fight for her. Nathaniel's gaze shifted back to her, and in that look, she saw the entirety of their shared past and the desperate hope for a future. He completely ignored Alistair, as if the other man had ceased to exist. "I will not fight him for you like a prize to be won," he said, his voice resonating with a profound sincerity that vibrated through her soul. "But I will fight for your happiness, for your freedom, even if that happiness is not with me. There is a difference, Eliza." He held her gaze for a moment longer, his eyes conveying everything his words could not. "He wants to own you. I want to set you free." With a final, long, meaningful look that felt like both a promise and a farewell, he gave a slight, formal bow. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, melting back into the shadows of the garden, leaving her alone on the terrace with a stunned and furious Alistair, the silence between them roaring with the magnitude of the choice that had just been laid at her feet. The morning after the ball dawned grey and listless, mirroring the state of Eliza's soul. She had spent a sleepless night, the confrontation in the garden playing over and over in her mind. Alistair had been cold and silent on the carriage ride home, his fury a palpable entity in the small space. She had left him at her door with a curt good night, the chasm between them wider than ever. Now, sitting in her morning room, a cup of untouched tea growing cold beside her, she felt adrift on a sea of confusion. A commotion in the street below drew her to the window. It was not the usual rumble of carriages and vendors. A small, scruffy boy, a street urchin with a face far too old for his years, was arguing with her family's footman at the front steps. The footman was trying to shoo him away, but the boy stood his ground, clutching a small, folded piece of paper. With a sigh, Eliza descended the stairs. "What is the meaning of this?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. The footman turned, his expression one of relief. "Miss Grayson, this boy insists he has a delivery for you, personally. I have told him to use the servants' entrance." The boy's sharp eyes darted to her. "Are you Miss Grayson?" he asked, his voice a raspy chirp. When she nodded, he thrust the paper into her hand. "This is for you, from the gent." He accepted the coin she offered, gave a quick, surprisingly formal nod, and then darted away, disappearing into the London fog as quickly as he had appeared. Eliza looked down at the paper in her hand. It was not the thick, creamy stationery of the Duke of Northmere, embossed with his crest. It was plain, slightly rough paper, folded into a simple square. Her fingers trembled as she broke the simple wax seal. The handwriting inside was stark and familiar, the strokes hurried but clear. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you," it began, the words a direct echo of her own thoughts. "But if you have even a sliver of doubt, meet me at St. George's Chapel at noon. I will tell you everything. I will hide nothing. After that, I will accept your judgment, whatever it may be. N. St. George's Chapel." The name was a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. The place where they were to have been married, the scene of her greatest humiliation, the audacity of it, the sheer, breathtaking arrogance, sent a fresh wave of anger through her. And yet, beneath the anger, a different feeling stirred, a sliver of doubt. His words from the garden, "He wants to own you. I want to set you free," had haunted her through the night. What if he was telling the truth? What if there was more to the story than his cowardice? The note was a desperate plea, not a ducal command. It was a gamble, and the stakes were her heart. At 5 minutes to noon, Eliza stood before the imposing stone facade of St. George's Chapel. The sky was the color of slate, threatening rain. She had told her family she was visiting a sick friend, a lie that sat uneasily on her tongue. Every instinct of self-preservation screamed at her to turn around, to go home to the safety of her engagement, to the predictable future Alistair represented. But the sliver of doubt had become a chasm of uncertainty, and she knew she could not move forward without knowing the truth, whatever it might be. She pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped inside. The chapel was vast, empty, and silent, the air cool and smelling of cold stone, old wood, and beeswax. Shafts of dusty grey light cut through the gloom from the high-arched windows, illuminating the motes of dust dancing in the still air. And there, at the far end of the long aisle, standing before the altar, was Nathaniel. He was a dark silhouette against the muted light of the stained glass window behind him. He was waiting for her at the very place he should have been 5 years ago. The irony was so thick, so potent, it was almost a physical presence in the room. As she began the long walk down the aisle, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space, she felt like a ghost of her younger self, the hopeful bride she had once been. He did not move until she was standing before him, a few feet of charged space separating them. In the dim light, she could see the strain on his face, the deep lines of exhaustion around his eyes. He looked like a man who had not slept in years. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice raw with an emotion he made no attempt to hide. "You chose this place deliberately," she stated, her voice not accusatory, but weary. "I did," he admitted, "because this is where the lie began. It is only right that the truth be told here." He took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for an ordeal. And then he began to speak. For nearly an hour, the words poured out of him, a torrent of confession held back for 5 long years. His voice, though low, filled the empty chapel, echoing with the weight of his regret. He laid everything bare. He spoke of his father, not as the cheerful lord she remembered, but as a man broken by a gambling addiction, a man who had fallen into a ruinous debt to a monster. He spoke the name, Baron von Hesse, and the way he said it, with a mixture of hatred and fear, made a shiver run down Eliza's spine. He described the Baron's treasonous demands, the plot to use the Grayson family's shipping interests for a smuggling operation that would have destroyed her father and implicated them all in treason against the crown. "He didn't just want my father's compliance," Nathaniel said, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "He wanted leverage. He wanted to ensure we could never betray him." He finally met her eyes, and the pain in them was so profound it made her ache. "He threatened you, Eliza. He threatened your family." He described, in horrifying detail, what he would do to you if I did not deliver your father's cooperation after our marriage. I was trapped. Marrying you would have made you his pawn. Refusing him would have made you his victim. He saw the disbelief warring with horror on her face. He had expected it. His story was fantastical, a Gothic tale of villains and secret plots. "I know it is difficult to believe," he said, his voice hoarse. "I would not believe it myself if I had not lived it." He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch, the kind a traveler might use to carry coins. The leather was soft and cracked with age and use. He held it out to her. "I don't just ask you to believe my words. I brought you proof." Her fingers trembled as she took the pouch. It was warm from his body. She loosened the drawstring and tipped the contents into her palm. There were several folded yellowed letters, a small tarnished silver locket, and a rolled piece of parchment tied with a faded ribbon. "My father's letters," Nathaniel explained, his voice a low murmur. "He wrote them in the weeks before I left, confessing everything, begging for a way out that did not exist." Eliza unfolded one. The script was frantic, barely legible, the paper stained with what could have been wine or tears. It spoke of the Baron's snare and a debt of honor that will cost me my soul. She then unrolled the parchment. It was a copy of a debt ledger, the figures astronomical, the terms brutal, and at the bottom Next to his father's trembling signature was a bold, arrogant seal pressed into dark red wax, an eagle with its talons extended, the seal of Baron von Hesse. It was all real. The last item was the locket. With fumbling fingers, she opened it. Inside was not a portrait of his mother or some other family member. It was a miniature portrait of her, painted in exquisite detail, her hair adorned with small white flowers, her eyes bright with the hope and love of a girl who believed her future was secure. It was the portrait she had given him as an engagement gift. "I carried it with me," he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. "Every day. It was all I had of you." He then described his years in exile. It was not the grand adventure Alistair's rumours had painted. It was a grim, lonely, relentless struggle. He had fled to the continent with nothing but the clothes on his back and the small amount of money his mother had pressed into his hand. He worked as a mercenary in forgotten wars, his life a commodity to be bought and sold. He learned the shipping trade from the ground up, working on docks in sweltering ports, slowly, painstakingly building a small fleet of his own, his every action guided by a single, burning purpose: to amass a fortune large enough to pay the debt and destroy the Baron's power. He lived like a monk, denying himself every comfort, his only focus the day he could return to her. A free man, a man worthy of her. The news of my cousin's death, the inheritance of the dukedom, it was a miracle I had not dared to pray for, he said, his gaze distant as he remembered. It was the final piece. It gave me the power, the security, to finally face the past, to return to England and to you. He took a step closer, his eyes pleading, his entire being focused on her. "My greatest regret," he said, his voice breaking on a sob he could no longer contain, "is the pain I caused you, the humiliation, the years you lost. My only defense, Eliza, is that every single day I was gone, I did it for you, to one day be worthy of you, to keep you safe from a man who would have destroyed you to get to me. Leaving you at this altar was the hardest thing I have ever done, and I have had to relive that choice every morning for 5 years." Eliza stood frozen in the silent chapel, the proof of his incredible story lying in her hands. The world, which had been tilted on its axis since his return, now seemed to have flipped over entirely. The narrative she had built her life upon for 5 years, the story of a cowardly lover and a jilted bride, had crumbled to dust. The man she had painted as a villain, the architect of her ruin, was a tragic hero. He had not abandoned her, he had sacrificed himself for her. The anger that had been her constant companion, her shield and her armor, simply dissolved. It evaporated in the face of his raw pain, his unwavering devotion. In its place, a wave of profound, overwhelming sorrow washed over her, sorrow for the years they had lost, for the boy who had been forced to become a hard man, for the girl who had been forced to bury her heart. And beneath the sorrow, surging up with an unstoppable force, was love, the deep, powerful, all-consuming love she had tried so desperately to deny, now resurrected and more potent than ever. She didn't know how she left the chapel. She had a vague memory of him watching her go, his face a mask of raw hope and fear, his fate now entirely in her hands. She walked through the streets of London in a daze, the city a blur of noise and colour that could not penetrate the bubble of her thoughts. She returned home and went straight to her room, ignoring the concerned questions of her mother and sister. She needed to be alone. She walked to her dressing table and sat down, her reflection in the mirror, a stranger with wide, shocked eyes. Her gaze fell upon her left hand, upon the magnificent diamond engagement ring Alistair had given her. It was a beautiful thing, flawless and brilliant, a testament to his wealth and status. It caught the light, throwing tiny rainbows onto the wall. But as she looked at it, it felt cold. A beautiful, cold, heavy weight on her finger. It was meaningless. It represented a safe harbor, a placid, predictable life of comfort and respectability. But her heart no longer wanted a safe harbor. Her heart longed for the stormy, passionate, dangerous sea she now knew was Nathaniel. He was the tempest and the tide, the lightning strike and the deep, fathomless ocean. The conflict was no longer about Alistair versus Nathaniel. It was no longer about a broken promise versus a stable future. The conflict was now entirely within her. Choosing Alistair was the sensible thing to do. It was the logical, rational choice that society, her family, and every ounce of self-preservation would applaud. But as she looked at the cold, glittering diamond, she knew, with a certainty that shook her to her very soul, that it was impossible. Choosing Nathaniel, with all the risks and uncertainties that entailed, was not a choice at all. It was the only thing she can do. It was the only thing her heart would allow. She slowly, deliberately, slipped the diamond ring from her finger and placed it on the polished surface of the dressing table. The cold weight was gone, and for the first time in 5 years, she felt a flicker of true, unburdened freedom. The heavy oak door of her father's study closed behind her with a soft, definitive click, shutting out the rest of the world. Lord Alistair Harrington was already waiting for her, standing stiffly by the fireplace, his posture radiating a tense, wounded pride. The room, with its scent of old leather and wood smoke, had always been a place of paternal authority and comfort for Eliza. But today it felt like a courtroom where a final, painful judgment was about to be rendered. She was calm, a strange, preternatural stillness having settled over her since she had left the chapel. The storm inside her had passed, leaving behind the quiet, unshakable certainty of the shore. "Alistair," she began, her voice even and gentle, devoid of the anger or confusion that had plagued her for weeks. "Thank you for meeting me." He gave a curt, jerky nod, his eyes cold. "Eliza, your note was abrupt. I assume this is about the Duke." She did not rise to the bait. There was no more room for argument or accusation. There was only the truth. She walked not to the chair opposite him, but to the large mahogany desk that dominated the center of the room. Slowly, deliberately, she pulled the magnificent diamond from her finger. The stone, which had once seemed a symbol of a secure future, now felt like a relic from another woman's life. She placed it gently on the polished wood, the facets catching the grey afternoon light, a final, cold sparkle before its meaning was extinguished. "Alistair, you are a good and honourable man," she said, her gaze steady and direct. "You have offered me a life of peace and security, and for the kindness you have shown me, I will always be grateful." She paused, taking a breath to deliver the final, unavoidable blow. "But I cannot marry you." His face, which had been a mask of cold anger, contorted with a flash of genuine pain before hardening once more. "It's him, isn't it?" he spat, the words laced with the venom of a man whose victory had been snatched away at the last moment. "The Duke. After all this time, after he publicly ruined you, you would choose that disgraced adventurer over me?" "I am not choosing him over you," Eliza replied, and it was the absolute truth. "I am choosing the truth, and the truth is, my heart was never fully mine to give. I thought I could live with that I could build a life on gratitude and respect. But I was wrong. I cannot give you my whole heart, Alistair, and you deserve a wife who can. A wife who will love you completely, without reservation, without a ghost from the past standing between you." His pride, the bedrock of his entire existence, was deeply, irrevocably wounded. He saw her not as a woman making a choice for her own soul, but as a prize he had lost. His response was as cold and bitter as a winter wind. So the disgraced Duke wins after all with his fantastical tales of adventure and sacrifice. How very romantic. He pushed himself away from the mantelpiece, his movements stiff and formal. "I hope you are happy with your choice, Eliza. I truly do. But do not be mistaken. Society will not be as forgiving as you are. You are tying yourself to a scandal, and that is a stain that does not wash away easily." He walked to the door without another glance at her, or at the ring that lay on the desk between them, a glittering testament to a future that would never be. The news of the broken engagement spread through London with the speed of a dropped torch in a dry field. Nathaniel heard it within hours, but he did not, as Eliza might have expected, rush to her side in a flurry of triumphant passion. His first visit was not to her but to her father. He was shown into the same study where Eliza had just ended her engagement. Lord Grayson received him with a stiff, guarded formality, his expression unreadable. Nathaniel knew that this was, in many ways, the more difficult conversation. He was not here to win the heart of a woman he knew already loved him. He was here to face the man whose family and honor he had so grievously damaged. "My lord," Nathaniel began, his voice steady and respectful, "I will not waste your time with pleasantries. I know that news of Miss Grayson's broken engagement to Lord Harrington has reached you, and I know that I am the cause." He did not wait for a response. From an inside pocket, he produced a sheaf of documents, which he placed carefully on the desk where the diamond ring had lain just hours before. "My lord, I know that my past actions brought shame and financial difficulty to your family. The abrupt end to the engagement 5 years ago caused a withdrawal of confidence from many of your ventures, a situation I am certain my father's debts did little to help." He gestured to the papers. "This is not a dowry. This is not an attempt to buy your daughter's hand. This is a reparation. The first document is the deed to a property in Mayfair, its value more than enough to cover any losses you may have incurred. The second is a bank draft for a considerable sum. It is a humble attempt to restore the honor I so carelessly damaged 5 years ago, a public acknowledgement of the debt I owe your house." He looked Lord Grayson directly in the eye, his own gaze unwavering. "Only after this is accepted, my lord. Only after I have made some small, inadequate restitution for the harm I have caused, will I dare to ask for the privilege of your daughter's hand in marriage." Lord Grayson was silent for a long moment. He looked from Nathaniel's earnest, solemn face to the papers on his desk. He was a proud man, and his family's honor was paramount. But he was also a father who had watched his daughter wither for 5 years, only to see her begin to bloom again in the last few weeks. He saw in Nathaniel's gesture not the arrogance of a wealthy duke throwing money at a problem, but the profound sincerity of a man desperate to atone for his past. He saw a man who understood that true honor was not about never falling, but about how one rose. Slowly, Lord Grayson reached out and placed a hand over the documents, a gesture of acceptance. A slow, weary smile touched his lips. "My daughter's happiness," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "is the only reparation I have ever required, Your Grace. It seems you have already provided it." A week later, the great doors of Northmere House were thrown open. The newly acquired London residence, which had been dark and shuttered for years, was now ablaze with light. 1,000 candles glittering in newly polished chandeliers, their light reflecting off gilded ceilings and gleaming marble floors. Nathaniel was hosting a magnificent ball, and he had invited everyone of importance in London. The ton arrived in droves, their curiosity a palpable force, the air buzzing with speculation. They came to see the disgraced Duke, to witness the next chapter in the scandal that had captivated them all. At the height of the evening, when the ballroom was a swirling vortex of silk, jewels, and whispered gossip, the music suddenly stopped. A hush fell over the crowd as all eyes turned to the top of the grand staircase. There stood Nathaniel, looking every inch the powerful Duke in his formal black attire. But he was not alone. On his arm was Eliza. A collective gasp went through the room. She was not in virginal white, nor in the pale pastels of an unmarried girl. She wore a gown of deep royal blue, the color of the Northmere duchy, a bold, magnificent statement. The gown was simple yet elegant, its rich color a declaration that she was not a blushing bride to be claimed, but a woman standing as an equal beside the man she loved. As they descended the staircase together, a united front. They were not a scandal, they were a vision of power and grace. Nathaniel led her to the center of the room, and holding her hand, he turned to address the assembled crowd. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it was clear and strong, carrying to every corner of the silent ballroom. "Friends, peers," he began, his gaze sweeping over the sea of curious faces, "you all know my story, or you think you do." A murmur went through the crowd. "Years ago, I failed in my duty to a woman I loved more than life itself. I made a choice that caused her and her family unimaginable pain and humiliation." He did not make excuses or offer justifications. He owned his failure completely. "I cannot erase that failure. I cannot give her back the years that were lost, but I can spend the rest of my life atoning for it." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "I have learned, through hard experience, that true honor is not about avoiding mistakes or pretending they did not happen. It is about having the courage to face them and to fix them, no matter the cost." His grip on Eliza's hand tightened, and he turned his gaze to her, his love and adoration shining for all the world to see. "And I am the most fortunate of men, for Miss Eliza Grayson, a woman of more grace, strength, and compassion than any man deserves, has done me the great honor of forgiving me." He turned back to the stunned audience, his voice ringing with triumph and joy. "And she has agreed to become my wife and the Duchess of Northmere." For a moment, there was a stunned silence. The sheer audacity, the public declaration, The complete rewriting of the narrative left the gossips of the ton speechless. Then, from the back of the room, an elderly peer began to clap, a slow, deliberate applause. Another joined in, and then another, until the entire ballroom erupted in a thunderous ovation, a wave of acceptance that washed away the last vestiges of the scandal forever. Later that night, when the party was still in full swing, a joyful, vibrant celebration of their future, Eliza and Nathaniel slipped away. They found their way to a small, secluded balcony that overlooked the vast, dark expanse of the gardens. The cool night air was a relief after the heat of the ballroom, and it was filled with the sweet, intoxicating scent of night, blooming jasmine. The music and laughter from the house were a distant, happy murmur, the soundtrack to their new beginning. The whispers, the scandal, the heartache, the 5 long years of winter, it was all behind them. Here, in the quiet dark, there was only peace and a profound, soul, deep sense of rightness. This was where they were always meant to be. Eliza leaned her head on his shoulder, a simple gesture of trust and contentment she had longed to make for what felt like a lifetime. She breathed in his scent, a familiar, comforting mix of sandalwood and strength, and felt the last knot of tension in her heart finally, completely, unwind. "Are you sure you are ready for this, Your Grace?" she murmured, a playful, teasing note in her voice that had been absent for far too long. "A lifetime of my company may prove to be a formidable challenge." Nathaniel turned, his silhouette dark against the star-dusted sky. He gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. His eyes, even in the dim light, were full of a love so intense, so absolute, it took her breath away. "I have been ready for 5 years, my love," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He lowered his head and gently, tenderly, kissed her. It was not a kiss of desperate passion, but of profound promise, a seal on a vow that had been made in his heart long ago. When he finally pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers. "My Duchess," he murmured, the words a prayer and a declaration. "My everything." The story ended there, on a quiet balcony under a sky full of stars, with the two of them holding each other, their long, painful journey finally over, their future, at long last, truly beginning.